Hey everybody, and welcome back to Submarine History. Today in briefing number 49, we continue the crawl along the torpedo history timeline, with today's installment covering the development and use of torpedoes by the U.S. Navy from 1895 to 1945. And yes, we're going to talk about the Mark 14 Torpedo Crisis, and we'll even talk about Fido and Cutie. Finally, at the end of the brief, we'll talk about how things might have changed in the Pacific War had the Mark 14 torpedo worked right from the start in December 1941. Read the description to this briefing. It has relevant related references and links. I have a Discord as well, and there's an invitation link on the channel banner. If you like the briefing, you can leave a super thanks or consider a channel membership. Your donation helps offset the cost of purchasing books, professional memberships, and software needed to write and record the briefings you've come to enjoy and appreciate. Finally, thank you to the United States Naval Institute for all they do preserving and promoting world naval history. If you have any questions about the briefing, leave them in the comment section below and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Okay, so generally, there are 4 periods of U.S. torpedo development, production, and deployment through 1945. The first period is the Howell torpedo period, whose design concept dates to 1870, but it's not until the 1880s when it progresses enough to get the prototype and eventually production phase. Overlapping that a little bit is the Whitehead torpedo period, and that goes from 1895 to 1922. Once again, overlapping a bit is the Bliss-Leavitt torpedo period, which runs from 1904 to 1945. That's finally followed by the U.S. Navy development and production period, which carries us from 1926 to 1945. The U.S. knew about the development of the Whitehead torpedo. Whitehead had conducted some demonstrations for the Austrian Navy starting in 1868, and word of the device's success began circulating around Europe. Conveniently, the U.S. had a Mediterranean squadron, and a team of officers from it paid a visit to the Whitehead facility in Fiume to view the torpedoes they were producing. A report on the visit was prepared by this team and forwarded to Vice Admiral David Porter, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time. Porter was enthusiastic about the development of the Whitehead torpedo, so much so that he ordered Bureau of Ordnance, or BUORD, to organize what he called a torpedo corps. As a result of this, Naval Torpedo Station Newport, Rhode Island was established in 1869. The vision was a comprehensive facility that would be the center of U.S. torpedo training, development, testing, and production. It's still in existence today as the Naval Undersea Warfare Center. In 1914, Naval Torpedo Station Keyport, Washington, was stood up to provide a West Coast location to store, modify, repair, and test torpedoes. It's still in existence today as the Naval Undersea Warfare Center Keyport. Then finally, there was the Naval Torpedo Station Alexandria, Virginia, stood up in 1918 to expand the production of torpedoes. It operated through the end of the Second World War, then was closed in 1945. The U.S. Navy had stood up the Naval Torpedo Station at Newport in 1869 for the purpose of training naval personnel and designing, testing, and building torpedoes. But the Navy's first torpedo wouldn't actually come from NTS Newport. It came from Lieutenant Commander John Howell. Howell was an active duty line officer who was also an inventor in his off-duty time. One of his projects was designing a torpedo that used a flywheel for its motive power, as opposed to the Whitehead torpedo, which used compressed air. Howell put down his ideas on paper for his torpedo in 1870 and patented it the following year in 1871. He worked on the concept and design for about 13 years until 1884, when his torpedo competed in and won a series of U.S. Navy trials against 2 other competitors to become the first torpedo to be adopted by the U.S. Navy and produced in volume. Here it is, the Howell Mark I torpedo. The innovative thing about this torpedo was the use of the flywheel to provide the motive power instead of compressed air driving a reciprocating engine. This torpedo, the Howell Mark I, would be loaded into a launching tube on the deck of a ship. Attached to the launching tube was a steam turbine that was connected to the torpedo inside the tube. The steam turbine would spin the flywheel up to 10,000 RPMs. The torpedo would then be shot from the tube. The flywheel would engage the 2 propellers and begin to drive them. The flywheel had the added benefit of acting as a gyroscope, minimizing torpedo roll and keeping it on a straight course. Think a motorcycle. As the flywheel spun down, the pitch of the props would automatically adjust to maintain a constant speed over the run distance. Now, the most compelling aspect of the Howell was the fact that the flywheel didn't leave a bubble trail like the Whitehead, making it harder to see. I had said a couple slides ago that Howell had won a set of Navy trials in 1884 against two other American torpedo manufacturers and was selected for a future production contract. Let's see how the Howell torpedo compared to a Mark IV Whitehead from the Fiume production facility produced in 1885. So on this chart, we have a prototype Howell from 1886 compared to a Whitehead Mark IV, which was being built, in Fiume over in Italy around 1885. They're pretty close in diameter, 14-inch for the Whitehead versus 13.2 for the Howell. But this Howell prototype, it's much shorter. It's 8 feet versus almost 15 feet for the Whitehead, and it's about half the weight at 325 pounds versus 660 pounds for the Whitehead. And then on top of that, with the Howell, you carried, 40% more explosive. They both had about the same speed, 23 and 24 knots, and they both had the same range, 600 to 700 yards. So this is why the U.S. Navy was interested in the Howell. It didn't leave a bubble trail, and it was a substantially smaller package with a bigger boom. The Navy had told Howell that, since he's actively serving as an officer in the Navy, he couldn't collect royalty payments on his patent. That, along with the fact Howell had a limited amount of time to work on improvements, since his daytime gig was with the Navy. So he sells his patent to the Hotchkiss Company in 1888. Hotchkiss gets an initial Navy contract for 30 torpedoes in January 1889, but they had problems getting the torpedo into production, and it's not until December 1891, almost 2 years after getting the contract, that they delivered the first 10 torpedoes to the Navy. And in that time, the Navy's requirements had changed. They wanted to be able to fire torpedoes from submerged tubes, and that was going to require a complete redesign of the Howell system. The range was also a problem as well. Surface ships firing torpedoes from 400 to 600 yards was, considered not good. And it was really only something you do to deliver a final blow to a stricken enemy ship. So even though the Navy had a contract with Hotchkiss for the Howell, the Navy obtained a license from Whitehead to manufacture their torpedo here in the U.S. as well. That license is obtained around 1891, with the first U.S. Navy Whiteheads going into production around 1894-1895, manufactured by the E.W. Bliss Company of Brooklyn, New York. So there is a period of time when the Navy is building Howell torpedoes through the Hotchkiss Company and Whitehead torpedoes through the E.W. Bliss Company. After the initial run of 50 Howells, the Navy dropped any further development or purchase of them in favor of the Whiteheads. Now, before we start walking the timeline for U.S. torpedoes, let's take a look at a detail for a Whitehead torpedo from around 1898. This information is from a U.S. Navy training manual regarding the short Mark I through III and long Mark I and II torpedoes that the U.S. was building under license from Whitehead. The following 5 slides were in Briefing 48. For those who haven't watched that briefing, we'll go over in general the components that make up a Whitehead. Here we have the warhead, and that contains the explosive and detonator, or exploder, as it's sometimes referred to. This warhead could be changed with an inert practice head for training. Notice how the exploder protrudes out from the nose of the warhead. It's a little hard to see, but the exploder has a center firing pin and a series of blades or whiskers around it, so that the firing pin would trigger if the torpedo hit was perpendicular, head on to the ship, or at a little bit of an off angle. The next section of the torpedo body is the air flask, which is our power source. The immersion chamber contains a hydrostatic valve and pendulum that work together to keep the torpedo at a constant depth during its run. The pendulum was critical as operation of the hydrostatic valve could cause the torpedo to change depth by several feet before settling in at the correct depth, and this pendulum acted to dampen those drastic depth changes to a few inches. The afterbody includes the torpedo steering and drivetrain. The gyroscope is here, and its purpose was to keep the torpedo on a constant course. The gyroscope could also manage a preset course change during the torpedo run. This slide represents the first 2 periods of torpedo development for the U.S. Navy. The Howell Mark I and the Whitehead Mark I entered service about the same time and were on independent development paths. The Howell Mark I was a 14-inch diameter weapon with an 82-pound explosive charge. They had a range of 800 yards at 24 knots. These torpedoes were in service from 1895 to 1903. In 1892, the E.W. Bliss Company of Brooklyn, New York, obtained a license from Whitehead to build their torpedoes for the U.S. Navy. They start with the short Whitehead torpedo. The short Whitehead Mark 1 through 3 were 18-inch diameter and 3.5 meters long, with a 170-pound explosive charge and a range of 800 yards between 26 and 28 knots. The short Whitehead Mark III is the first torpedo to be used on subs. In this case, it was used for the A through D classes. A long Whitehead entered service in 1898. These were 5 meters long as opposed to the 3.5 of the shorts. The long Mark II carried a 131-pound explosive charge, not much more than a short Mark III. However, range is about doubled to 1,500 yards at 28 knots. Now, all these Whiteheads will be removed from service by 1922. The Bliss-Leavitt family of torpedoes represents the third period of torpedo development for the U.S. Navy. The E.W. Bliss Company, while they were producing the Whiteheads under license, they were working on their own torpedo design. They had a designer, Frank McDowell Leavitt, who developed an experimental 21-inch diameter torpedo and demonstrated it to the U.S. Navy. This would lead the Navy to select E.W. Bliss as the domestic designer and producer of torpedoes in 1904. On this slide, we have the first 4 Bliss-Levitts. The Mark 1 through 3 are 21-inch diameter with 200 pounds of explosive and a range of 4,000 yards at 26 knots, another big improvement in range. The Mark IV is the first Bliss-Leavitt designed for submarines. This is an 18-inch diameter weapon, still carrying about 200 pounds of explosive, but it is smaller diameter and has a shorter range, 2,000 to 3,000 yards at up to 30 knots. And these Mark IVs went into the C and D class submarines. Okay, a lot is going on in this slide. As you can see, Bliss-Levitts end up with 3 production lines, one for ships, one for subs, and now one for aircraft torpedoes. On the submarine line, the Mark VII was considered groundbreaking in design because it was the first U.S. torpedo to use steam power for propulsion. Steam was generated by mixing water and alcohol as a fuel and air in a combustion chamber where the mixture was ignited to produce steam and drive contra-rotating propellers. The Navy will fork off the submarine line and start their aircraft line with the modified Mark VII torpedoes. The Mark 7D, it's on the slide, but it was never deployed. The rest of the Mark 7s were similar in characteristics. That means around 200 to 300 pounds of explosive with ranges out to 6,000 yards and up to 35 knots. The Mark 7 was so much more advanced that the Navy would eventually remove all Mark 6 torpedoes and earlier from service by 1922. The E through H class subs used the Mark 6, and the K, O, and R classes the Mark 7. On the ship line, the Mark 8 is the first real long-range torpedo produced. Longer and bigger diameter, 6.3 meters long and 21 inches in diameter. Between 300 and 500 pounds of explosive and a range out to 15,000 yards and a maximum speed of 27 to 29 knots. Production of airdropped and surface ship torpedoes by Bliss-Leavitt will stop at the Mark 7 and Mark 8 torpedoes respectively. The submarine line continues with the Mark 9, used on the R and S boats, and the Mark 10 on the S boats. There was also a special version of the Mark 9 intended for battleships. And the Mark 9 is the first 21-inch diameter torpedo for submarines. The Mark 9 is the last torpedo designed by Bliss, and the Mark 10 is the last torpedo built by them. The Mark 10 saw a lot of service during World War II. The S-class boats were limited to the Mark 10 because of the tube size. But other newer fleet boats could use either the Mark 10 or the Mark 14. The Mark 10 used the Mark 3 exploder, which was a contact-only detonator, so these torpedoes didn't have the same problem as the Mark 14. But like the Mark 14, they did run a little deep. That problem was addressed early at the start of the Pacific War, and these torpedoes gave good service. The Mark 10 torpedoes had 400 to 480 pounds of explosive. They had a range up to 5,000 yards with a top speed of 36 knots, depending on the mod or version. Finally, we get to the fourth period of U.S. Navy torpedo development. This is the Navy Torpedo Station Newport period. During this period, from 1926 to 1945, the NTS takes on the direct responsibility of designing and building torpedoes. This doesn't mean the torpedo station operated in a vacuum. They still relied on outside consultants and contractors for certain expertise and production capabilities. The Mark 11 is the first torpedo designed and built by the U.S. Navy from start to finish. That surface line culminates in the Mark 15, which was the primary surface-launched torpedo during World War II. About 9,700 Mark 15s were produced. The Mark 14s carried between 5 and 800 pounds of explosive with a range up to 9,000 yards and a top speed of 46 knots. So the Mark 15 used the same Mark 6 exploder as the Mark 14 torpedo. So U.S. destroyers would have suffered the same problems as submarines with the Mark 14. Here's the thing, though. Those destroyers, they would not have understood the problems that were happening with the Mark 15 because they would have been launching them at night and from such a distance. They just really would not have had a good understanding of ultimately what was happening to those torpedoes. Unlike the submarine crews, they knew exactly what those torpedoes were doing. In the submarine line, here we have the infamous Mark 14 torpedo. This was the primary torpedo for fleet boats during World War II, with around 13,000 being produced. The Mark 14 carried between 500 and 660 pounds of explosive with a range up to 9,000 yards and a max speed of 46 knots. During peacetime, this torpedo was fitted with the Mark 5 exploder, similar to the Mark 6, but only with a contact detonator. The Mark 6 exploder, which was a combination contact magnetic influence detonator, had been developed during the 1920s by NTS Newport under great secrecy. Production models were kept secretly locked away, including all the training, maintenance, and operators information. And it's not until the summer of 1941 that information regarding this exploder makes its way to the fleet. And at that point, there wasn't enough time to do any fleet-wide testing with it before the war ultimately starts. We'll talk more about the Mark 14 and the Mark 6 exploder on the next slide. The Mark 18 torpedo was an electric torpedo based off the German G7E, several of which were recovered from the beaches of the eastern United States during Operation Drumbeat. The Navy had been working on its own electric torpedo since the 1920s, but progress was lagging, so they ended up deciding to copy the German design just to speed things up. About 9,000 Mark 18s were produced. It had a 600-pound explosive warhead with a maximum range of 4,000 yards at 29 knots. So half the range and speed of the Mark 14, but like the G7E and the Howl, it didn't leave a bubble wake, making it suited for daytime attacks. This torpedo used either the Mark 8, which was a contact, or Mark 9, which was a contact magnetic influencer exploder, which did not have the problems that the Mark 6 exploder had. Having said that, the design, testing, and production of the Mark 18 was rushed, and this torpedo had problems with the battery system, and it took until 1944 to sort those issues out. The Mark 27 Cutie was an electric-powered passive acoustic homing torpedo that was a defensive weapon carried by fleet boats against surface escorts, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. Finally, we have the aircraft-launched torpedo line. During World War II, the primary aircraft-launched torpedo was the Mark 13, of which about 13,000 were produced. This torpedo used the Mark 6 exploder, which was a contact-only detonator and did not suffer the same problems as the Mark 6 exploder. However, the Mark 13 torpedo itself had a lot of other problems, and it took until 1944 to work them out and make it a reliable weapon. And then last, but certainly not least, is the Mark 24 torpedo, Fido, as it was called. And this was an airdropped passive acoustic homing torpedo for use against submarines. And we'll talk about this more in a second. Let's take a look at the Mark 14 torpedo briefly. Now, I debated getting into the details of the Mark 14 Torpedo Crisis, and I decided not to do it at this time. If you want to listen to a deep dive into the topic, I suggest Drachenfell's channel or the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. They both do a pretty good takes on the subject. I want to do my own dive on it, but I need to make sure I'm not just regurgitating the content from those two podcasts. You know, it's a large, complex subject, and even those two podcasts just kind of scratch the surface of the whole situation and story. But I'm already thinking about how I can present the story from a different angle, but that's going to be a project down the road. Anyways, I have links to those two podcasts in the description to this briefing for your reference. So what were the problems with the Mark 14 torpedo? Well, number one, while not the first problem identified by submariners, the first problem to be resolved was the anti-countermining safety of the Mark 6 exploder. The anti-countermining safety was supposed to prevent the pressure wave of an exploding torpedo from detonating another torpedo that followed the first torpedo closely. This safety consisted of a pressure-sensitive diaphragm that would push a safety pin into place and prevent the firing pin by an explosive pressure wave. As the pressure wave passed, the diaphragm would then pull the safety pin back so that the torpedo could explode when it hit. The problem was that the safety pin could get pushed into place from the sea pressure of a flooded torpedo tube at periscope depth. When this happened, the safety pin could get stuck in that safe position throughout the run of the torpedo, causing a dud hit. This problem was identified and resolved in the spring of 1942 by deactivating the safety feature. And this problem isn't usually addressed in the literature, but it is touched on in Wildenberg and Polmar's book, Ship Killers, published by USNI Press. The second problem was that the Mark 14 torpedo ran about 10 feet too deep when fitted with a warhead. This problem was identified and resolved by August 1942, and the fix was for skippers to take this depth differential into account when setting torpedo depth until the torpedo itself could be redesigned. The third problem was torpedoes prematurely exploding when the magnetic influence feature of the Mark 6 exploder was used. There were two types of failures: premature explosions when the torpedoes reached their arming distance, or torpedoes would explode close to, but still far enough away from a target that they did little or no damage. There were theories as to why the torpedoes were prematurely detonating, which centered around where the torpedoes were being used relative to the Earth's magnetic field. But the magnetic problems were never conclusively identified. Instead, the submarine force was just instructed to deactivate the magnetic influence feature of the Mark 6 exploder in June of 1943. Now, the fourth problem was contact detonators failing when they hit a target, resulting in a dud shot, even at a 90-degree angle, which was considered textbook shooting. This problem wasn't even identified until the running depth and the magnetic influence problems were resolved. In 1943, a series of tests were conducted at Pearl Harbor. These tests involved dropping torpedoes with the contact detonators, but no warhead explosive, on a steel plate from a height of 90 feet. The test showed that the firing pins were being crushed and failing to cause detonation when torpedoes would strike the plate at 90 degrees. When a torpedo would strike the plate at 45 degrees, the firing pin would successfully travel and detonate 50% of the time. To properly resolve this issue, the Mark 6 exploder was going to have to be completely redesigned, which was going to take a long time. In the interim, some modifications to the firing pin were made at Pearl Harbor by September 1943. Those modifications, along with instructions to skippers to make shots at an angle to a target, greatly reduced the dud rate. Overall, throughout the war, the Mark 14 dud rate was estimated to be between 60 and 80%. The final problem with the Mark 14 torpedo was that it could occasionally malfunction after firing and circle back at the submarine. This problem was never addressed on the Mark 14. The Mark 15 had collars to prevent circular runs. Here is a cutaway profile view of a Mark 14 warhead showing the Mark 6 exploder. And as I said earlier, it was designed and built by NTS Newport. The exploder is inside of the warhead. The exploder itself was contained inside a box, and it sat on a plate that was inserted into a recessed area at the bottom of the warhead. This is a combination exploder. It has both a contact and magnetic influencer detonation function. If the warhead made physical contact with the ship, there would be a transfer of energy inside the exploder as the torpedo was stopped by the hull of the ship, triggering the firing pin. Otherwise, if the torpedo passed under the keel of the ship, the magnetic influencer would trigger the firing pin. Now, if you wanted to deactivate the magnetic influencer, you had to remove the exploder from the warhead, open the exploder box, disable the magnetic influencer, and then put it back in the warhead. At the time during the Torpedo Crisis, some people believed that the exploder wasn't being properly resealed when it was put back inside the warhead, allowing water to enter the cavity that the exploder was in and causing it to fail. As a comparison, here on this slide, we have a German torpedo exploder. Like the U.S. Mark 6 exploder, this is a combination contact magnetic influencer device. This exploder was simply screwed into the tip of the warhead and was detonated either by the nose or whiskers making contact with the hull of a ship, triggering the firing pin. The other way was that the torpedo passed under the keel of the ship, acting the magnetic influencer, which in turn triggered the firing pin, like the Mark 6. Let's talk about two other notable torpedoes the U.S. developed and used during World War II, and we'll start with the Mark 24 anti-submarine torpedo. The Mark 24 was an airdropped, passive homing torpedo entering service in May of 1943. Homing was by 4 crystal hydrophones arranged around the body with a simple guidance system that steered toward the loudest noise. The launch parameters were 125 knots from 250 feet for airdrops. This was a small torpedo, only 7 feet long, with a 92-pound explosive charge and an overall weight of 680 pounds. It was battery operated, and it could run at 12 knots for 10 minutes, giving it an effective range of 4,000 yards. During the war, the Allies dropped 340 Mark 24s and 264 attacks, sinking 37 submarines, mostly German, but a few Japanese as well. And that represents an 11% kill rate. It seems terrible, but you have to remember that when hunting submarines, it was a team sport involving surface and air assets with many different tools to get that sub-kill. The Germans knew that it was possible the Allies would develop this type of torpedo, and sonar operators were briefed during training on the types of sounds they could expect to hear from such devices. And the Type 21 U-boat, with a maximum submerged speed of 17 knots, would have been able to outrun Fido. This is the Mark 27 Cutie. This is an anti-submarine warfare ship torpedo introduced into service in June 1944. It was a variation of the Mark 24, so it had a similar physical and performance characteristics, and it was also battery powered with passive homing. Similar to the Mark 24, it traveled at 12 knots for 12 minutes, giving it about a 5,000 yard range. This was a defensive weapon to use against convoy escorts. The torpedo would leave the tube under its own power, they would call that swimming, so as not to reveal the sub's position. The hydrophones would have listened for the sound of an escort's high-speed screws and then home in on that sound. Likely you'd have them in the stern tubes so that you could take a shot at an approaching escort as you were withdrawing after an attack, similar to concept to the Germans' use of the Zakoning or Wren anti-escort torpedo. 106 Mark 27s were fired against Japanese escorts during the war, sinking 24 ships and damaging 9 others, a total of 33 escorts. That's a 31% hit rate, which is pretty good. You didn't have to sink an escort. It was enough to disable it, so it had to break contact with you. You were just looking for a mission kill. These next 2 slides are from briefing number 45 on the Type 21 U-boat. On this slide, I've plotted 2 parameters, the number of U-boats at sea, which is the gray line, and the ship-to-U-boat loss ratio, which is the yellow line, both over time. I've drawn boxes around the first and second happy times. The first happy time goes from like July 1940 to April 1941. You can see the gray line it's pretty low for that period of time, meaning we don't have a lot of U-boats at sea. However, the yellow line, our ship-to-U-boat loss ratio, is quite high for the same period. So we're sinking a lot of ships compared to the number of U-boats we're losing. So we're efficient. This is followed by a period of time when the Allies had cracked the 3-rotor Enigma machine and had made substantial progress in ASW technology and tactics. So what happens? The ship-to-U-boat loss ratio goes way down while we're putting more and more U-boats at sea. Now there is the second happy time, which kind of masks the fact that the Germans had lost the initiative in the Battle of the Atlantic. During the second happy time, U-boats are seal clubbing merchant shipping along the eastern United States seaboard. In this area of the battle, it's a little bit like going back to the first happy time because the U.S. is just completely unprepared. However, as with the first happy time, like the British, the U.S. tightens things up and eventually it's able to gain the upper hand against the U-boats. And you can see on the graph how from August 1942 on, our ship-to-U-boat loss ratio, it kind of flatlines regardless of the number of U-boats we have at sea. They just didn't have the ability anymore to penetrate that ASW ring around convoys. Now, these lines would have changed to a degree with the introduction of the Type 21 U-boat, but they were too late for that to make any impact on the war. So we'll never actually really know how much that graph would have changed. But anyways, why are we talking about U-boats? Let's look at this chart. Now we are comparing ship-to-U-boat loss ratio, that's the green line, against the ship-to-fleet boat loss ratio, which is the orange line. This chart covers December 1941 to May 1945. Again, the second happy time is pretty good for the Germans. And then see how after July 1942 it trends down to almost 0 some months, and it just kind of stays there for the duration of the war. The Germans can't make meaningful gains in an increasingly difficult ASW environment. Now this is opposite from what the fleet boats experienced during the war. From December 1941 to September 1943, fleet boats aren't very impactful because of a Mark 14 dud rate at that time of about 90%. We're still sinking some ships. Some of those ships would be sunk by Mark 10s and others from Mark 14s that would occasionally function correctly. Or skipper's calcs were a little off and the Mark 14 just happened to hit at an angle, which wouldn't crush the firing pin. Because fleet boats were not impactful during this period of time, the Japanese apparently didn't see a serious need to invest in an anti-submarine warfare program. That's important, because when the Mark 14 is finally fixed in October 1943, for the U.S., it's like their own fleet boat happy time. They hit the Japanese full force, and they have an incredible run for a year because the Japanese are not prepared. By the time the Japanese get a handle on the scope of the fleet boat threat, it's too late for them to do anything meaningful. By October 1944, fleet boats have substantially reduced the Japanese merchant shipping fleet, and our ship-to-fleet boat loss ratio flatlines for the remainder of the war simply because there are fewer targets. Now the question is, how would this chart have changed if the Mark 14 had worked right at the start of the war? Well, in that case, the fleet boat happy time would have moved way over to the left, or the start of the war. That period of success would have been a little shorter, as the Japanese, seeing fleet boats as an imminent threat, would have invested heavily in an anti-submarine warfare program. Why? Because like the British, they would have seen that they had to, or potentially they would lose the war from inaction on that front. That increase in effort would also have led to more fleet boats being lost. So one way to look at it is that the Mark 14 torpedo crisis probably saved U.S. submariners' lives. It also would have taken longer to reach that terminal ship-to-fleet boat loss ratio, but you'd still get there eventually because the U.S. just so overmatched the Japanese in the Pacific theater. Okay, we're finally at the end of the briefing, and I hope you enjoyed it. Leave your questions and comments below. Come to the Submarine History Discord and say hi. Till next time, peace out.